Hi, and welcome to another edition of Studio 411. I'm your host, Larry DeSilva, and we've got an interesting program for you today. Music, photography, all sorts of crazy stories, and we will get to it right away. The bands, the photos, the stories, no cameras allowed. My life as an outlaw rock and roll photographer. That's the name of the book, and that tells the story in words and photo of how our guest today, Julian David Stone, entirely by sneaking his equipment into concerts, amassed an incredible archive of over 10,000 rock and roll photos, starting by simply stashing a camera in his socks, then taping equipment all over his body, to finally customizing a jacket to hide equipment from security guards. This gentleman shot some of the great acts of the 80s, Prince, U2, The Police, Bowie, REM, Elvis Costello, The Grateful Dead. So again, we've got a lot to talk with this gentleman about. The book, again, published by For the Duration Press. For more information, juliandavidstone.com. And we welcome to Studio 411, Julian David Stone. Welcome, Julian. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on.
Our pleasure, our pleasure. Now tell me, as we usually ask authors, but even in this book that is more photos than words, but really the photos do tell a lot that doesn't need to be spelled out. How did the idea for the book come about?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. It started a few years ago, right around the time that David Bowie and Prince passed away. And I posted some pictures on Facebook that I had taken of them back in the 1980s, and all of a sudden I just got inundated with people who were asking me, why do you have these pictures? What's the story behind this? And I started to talk more and more about it on Facebook, some of the adventures I had, and some people that knew me back then sort of reminded me some of the stories that I had told them back then about all of my exploits, sneaking my equipment into concerts. And somebody suggested I do a book, and the more I thought about it, I thought it was a great idea. I did a Kickstarter to raise money, which went really, really well, and then here we are a couple years later with a completed book that's out on the market.
I was going to say, and I think you and I talked about this off air, 2016 was a tough year for music, the music industry, and certainly rock and roll. So the passing of such icons such as Bowie and Prince certainly, gave you by no means the impetus to really start to share those images with the masses, and I think that's a great thing that evolved out of that.
Absolutely, yeah. It was awful with their passing, but for me personally, it allowed me to sort of revisit this time when I was in the 1980s, when I was just completely in this world, and Bowie and Prince were among the biggest stars. But as I'm sure we'll get to, I shot U2, The Police, Talking Heads, pretty much everybody that was big back then. I was lucky enough to photograph and put them in my book.
Now, before I move on to my next question, I have to ask, is there or would there be plans for a sequel to this book? Because I know there were a lot of bands, at least from the list I saw, Beach Boys, Moody Blues, a lot of bands that I'm a favorite of, that look like you also had images of them. So is there a possibility that you would have enough to do a follow-up book if necessary?
There's definitely enough left over for another book, absolutely. I'm still in the midst of getting this one out there, but if it does well enough, and it is doing well, it's certainly something I would love to do, and I have been asked about it. And one of the things you sort of touched on, there is actually a lot of text with the book, because I wanted to tell the stories of all my adventures of, evading security and everything. And there are other stories that didn't make it in this first volume that I'd love to put in another volume.
There you go. See, I've already planted the seed, so
Yes.
we will hope for that. I understand that as a young boy, like myself, you tried but were not as successful as a musician. I understand you played the French horn, which actually I played the trumpet and French horn, so I immediately kind of bonded to that section in the book. I'm glad to say I was pretty good at it, but in your case, I guess it was not something that you were meant to do for a living.
No, most definitely not. I had about a 3 or 4 month career with the French horn and drove my teacher completely crazy. And as I mentioned in the book, this shows you how much into rock and roll I was. I picked the French horn because John Lennon is holding one on the cover of Sgt. Pepper. So that's the instrument that I gravitated to when they sort of had the assembly at my school, where they had all these instruments out. And I remember everybody went to the clarinet, and there was no guitar, which is what I would have wanted to go to. So I went to the French horn because that was the closest I could find to a connection to the Beatles. And yeah, sadly, no, the career did not happen producing music.
Could have been the next Benny Goodman. You never know. But yeah.
Yes.
Tell me about the first experience. If I understood correctly, your first experience utilizing a camera at a concert and what it took to accomplish the goal. Am I correct? It was the Ramones was the first time you utilized a camera?
Absolutely. It was the first time that I took in a real 35 millimeter camera. I had, as you talked about, there was my attempts to play music that had failed miserably, and I was really into photography. So the Ramones were coming to town. I thought, oh, great, I'll go down there. I'll take pictures of them. This will be my way into the world of rock and roll. So I showed up at the club with my camera bag over my shoulder, and a guard just laughed at me after, looking at and seeing my equipment. And he pointed up at a sign that said, "No cameras allowed," and just sent me on my way. And I went back to my car, and I was about to dump the equipment and then, go back to the concert. And I went, there's got to be a way around this. Very quickly, I hid the little bit of equipment I had and the film on my body using my socks. This was the 80s. I had big tube socks on, shoved the stuff down there. I put the film, shall we say, in an area that I was not going to be searched. And I walked back up to the guard. He kind of looked at me, didn't see the camera bag, let me into the show. I went into the bathroom, assembled everything, and I came out just as the Ramones hit the stage, and I photographed them. And after that, I was hooked. Over the next 5 or 6 years, I was just completely obsessed, and I shot 10,000 pictures of just about every band of the era. When they came to town, I made sure I was there and made sure I got my equipment in.
Now, a couple of things. One was, at that point, you were, in the beginning, not working for a magazine or doing it with some sort of perhaps money or sponsorship coming in. So, in other words, I know ticket prices were a lot more reasonable in the 70s and 80s, but you were basically paying for these concerts, the tickets out of your own pocket, correct?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, back then, I think the Ramones show was probably $5 or $10 tops. This was a long time ago, and this is before digital, so you did have to pay for film. But like I said, I'm a photographer, and you could sort of get these bulk rolls of black and white film that you could roll into little rolls and put in your camera, which drove down the cost. Plus, I would do my own processing of black and white, not color. Color you had to send to the lab, but I did my own black and white, so that helped save money.
Now, on a percentage over those 5 or 6 years that you did this, what would you say, 50-50, 70-30 in terms of the photographs, black and white versus color? What percentage of your archives are what?
That's a good question. I'd say it's probably 60-40 black and white, maybe 55-45. It's pretty close. I never had any rhyme or reason to why one or the other. I tended to shoot both at every show, and I would just sort of grab a bunch of rolls of film, and I just remember, when you're in the heat of it, because again, this is before digital, today you could have a chip in your camera that you can shoot thousands of photos and never have to swap it out. Back then, every 24 or 36 exposures, you had to put a new roll of film in, and I remember it would be whichever roll my hand happened to grab next determined whether it was black and white or color at that moment.
So because of the kind of subterfuge that was going on with getting as close as you could, move around with the ability to try to take some shots, I gather you didn't go into the concert saying, okay, I'm going to do 24. I believe later on there were 36 shots per roll with some of the Kodachrome, and say, okay, I'm going to limit myself to just this. So you were like, I'm going to do as much as I can, and if I have to, I'm going to figure out a way to, finagle getting another roll, getting the other one tucked away. So you didn't just go in saying, I'm going to limit myself to just 12 or 24 shots.
No. I would bring in as many rolls as I could get in, and I would try to shoot as many as I could. But it was a little bit, because I was speaking my equipment and I wasn't supposed to be in there, I also couldn't just have my camera out all the time. So I also had to pick my opportunities and make sure that security was not watching. So that also was sort of a self-limiter. I couldn't just be out there shooting freely.
It doesn't seem to folks like you and I that long ago, but again, for younger folk, they're like hearing terms like Kodachrome and changing roles or whatever.
Yeah.
They're like, what are they talking about? It's amazing the technology, how it's advanced, but yet it's like the proponents of the old black and white films. There are people that say, you know what, the old box cameras, the old method of making movies, that there's still a place for those kind of things. Do you find that now someone who came along, or let's say yourself, transported to this day and age now, the 21st century, would you have gotten as much enjoyment, and or would it have been as difficult or perhaps easier to do what you did in the 80s to do it now?
Well, it certainly would have been easier because smuggling in rolls of film wouldn't have been one of the things I had to deal with, and that, you go into a show, sometimes I would try to get 15 or 20 rolls in. That takes up a fair amount of space. So that certainly would have made it easier. The rest of it, the size of the equipment hasn't really changed. A digital SLR with a good lens is pretty much about the same size. But no question, not having to smuggle the film in would have been great, and not having to switch rolls out. Like I said, today you could shoot thousands of photos on one little SD card and not worry about, loading, unloading, hiding it, all that stuff. So that certainly would have been easier.
And during those early years, or really probably within the first couple of months, did it then, or maybe in retrospect, dawn on you that this activity of what you did at concerts became a passion, but do you find later that it become an addiction, or maybe a culmination of both?
I don't know. Certainly not in a negative sense, an addiction. I was certainly loved the rush of it and the excitement of smuggling in the equipment, and I was just, I loved the music, and it was my way of being a part of it. And the fact that I was smuggling equipment in, certainly for the first few years, was also my way of being part of the rebellion. This is the question I would often get, like, did you not get to enjoy the show, or that sort of thing? And I found actually quite the opposite, that I enjoyed the show. And in fact, the better the show, the more of a responsibility that I felt to take great pictures. It was like, I wanted, if I was seeing Prince, I wanted to capture Prince in all his glory because he was so good. So that's kind of the effect it had on me. But I was just obsessed with it, but I don't know if I was quite addicted, but I did really love it.
Right, and as you said, it would be a good addiction, but certainly if you were doing it today, I mean, one would have to have quite a job in terms of financial outlay, because I don't know how most people would be able to afford to attend these kind of shows. I mean, most of these people that we're talking about would set you back $200-300 today per show. Not to mention the fact that with the internet and computers, you probably would have difficulty getting the kind of seats that you might have gotten back in the day.
Right. Like, for instance, in the book, I have some of my ticket stubs, which I've kept for all these years. And the ticket stub for the Prince show from 1985, where I'm like 10th row center, the cover price on the ticket is $13.
Wow.
So, little different.
Oh yeah, that's like I can remember in '77 at the now defunct New Haven Coliseum. Saw the Eagles with a newcomer by the name of Jimmy Buffett. Little did we know, for I believe it was $15 or $20. Probably we'll call it closer to 20 with the quote fees back in the day. But yeah, that was something. We don't have a photo of the Prince ticket. We do have a photo of, I think, one of the Jerry Garcia or Grateful Dead tickets. So if we can put that up, again, you can get an idea of not only what tickets used to look like. Again, they've changed now. Now they'll probably fade with the passing of a couple of weeks. Whereas these, the way they were printed up, if you were able to get it and put it under some sort of a plexiglass or glass, you had yourself a memento for life, as you can see in that photo. Julian, go ahead.
There's not even really tickets anymore. You know, it's a piece of paper you print at home, so it's very different.
Yeah, I mean, unless you do like a will call, you know, sometimes I'll do one or the other. But again, I find that even with baseball games, et cetera, sporting events, the ticket, if it's left out for too long, the ink or whatever you want to call it, the digital ink starts to almost disappear totally. So you lose. That's like the other thing too, that people used to have a great time. They still try to do it now, collecting checks of famous musicians, celebrities, et cetera. Again, most people now don't use checks, so there's kind of another money-making scheme, kind of hobby, memorabilia option that is kind of going by the wayside. So, you know, again, that's, I guess you take the good with the bad, but that's the way it is. Julian David Stone joining us for the hour here on Studio 411. The book, No Cameras Allowed, My Career as an Outlaw Rock and Roll Photographer, published by For the Duration Press. And for more information on Julian and his work, www.juliandavidstone.com. We'll go to one of the first concerts that piqued my curiosity. Dave Edmunds, who was a guy that I think I saw about 4 or 5 years later at Toad's Place here in New Haven, Connecticut. Loved the show, and that was back in the day when smoking was still allowed. So I mean, you want to talk about, you know, a haze. It might not have been purple, but it was definitely a haze. We have a shot of one of the guys that showed up with his bandmate during the Dave Edmunds show. We have a shot of Brian Setzer, who of course was with the well-known Stray Cats. And tell me a little bit about Dave Edmunds, that experience. I think he's a very underrated guy, great musician, at this point pretty much retired. But what do you remember about Dave's concert that night?
Sure. First of all, I want to thank you for asking me about Dave Edmunds. I've done like 100 interviews, and you're the first person, and I love Dave Edmunds, so thank you.
That's because I'm old. No, I mean, you look at it. I mean, I just found a clip recently, to digress for a minute, a YouTube clip of Carl Perkins along with a who's who, Jeff Lynne, Tom Petty, George Harrison, Ringo Starr, Dave Edmunds sitting to the left of Harrison. I mean, this guy, besides being a great rockabilly, rock and roll musician, is like hanging out with the elite. I mean, Carl Perkins, you're talking about transversing, or that's not even the right word, spanning 50 years of rock and roll. And again, to me, back in the 80s with things going on, you know, I didn't get to a lot of shows, but boy, when I saw he was coming to Toad's Place, I was there. And that was one of the few concerts I probably went to see. But to get back to you again, you enjoyed that question, eh? They're good.
Yeah. Oh, Dave Edmunds was fantastic. I was a huge fan of him, and this show was a couple things. It was the first time, I'll just quickly, because it gets a little technical, but I was working on this technique that had to do with sort of fooling the light meter on the camera to allow you to take pictures at a faster shutter speed, because it had to do with, particularly back then, you were almost always shooting a bright object surrounded by a lot of black on stage, because this was before, you know, lighted boards and all the stuff that musicians, everybody has now. So this was the first time I did that at a concert, and it worked really well. I was really happy with the pictures. And also, Dave Edmunds had an album out that was doing well, and he was really popular, but everybody also knew that he had produced the Stray Cats' first album, which was hugely popular, and they were in town also playing. So there was hope that they might show up, and sure enough, towards the end of the show, 2 of them came out and played with him, and it was just an amazing experience. And it was the first time I sort of experienced that thing where you go to a concert and you get that drop-in from another famous artist, because then it's sort of like we're all part of that club, you know, that is rock and roll, where everybody just gets together and jams. And for that moment, you're part of that world. And so it was just a wonderful experience to see Dave Edmunds and to see those guys play with him.
I'll try to give you a couple of mine. I'm sure they don't rate with the ones you probably can tell me. Give me a couple of instances, that one aside, where you went to see, and I'll give you my first example. I went to go see a band, the guy that was big in the 80s, John Cafferty and the Beaver Brown Band, and who's in the audience and is friends with him and goes up on stage, but Mickey Thomas of Elvin Bishop, Jefferson Starship, later Starship. Great thing. And a second one, Eddie Money about 10, 12 years ago, who comes out on stage and does a couple of numbers, including one that was their signature song together, Ronnie Spector. Give me a Give me a couple of years where you had you went to see show A, photograph it, or maybe not even photograph it, and then look who comes out on stage.
Well, part of the story in the book I talk about towards the end of my photography career, I became a big Deadhead, a big follower of the Grateful Dead. So that was something that happened with some regularity with the Grateful Dead, and one of the best ones was a show here in Los Angeles where, for the second set, Bob Dylan came out and played the whole second set with the Grateful Dead, and that was pretty special to see Dylan. God, there's got to be more of them. I don't know why I'm blanking. I can't think of another one. There were other ones. I saw Ornette Coleman with the Grateful Dead. Clarence Clemens of Springsteen's band also popped in with the Grateful Dead. God, I'm not thinking of another one at this moment. I'm sure one will pop into my head. But those were some around the Grateful Dead that I saw that were very memorable.
The only one I can tell you that I missed, and it was kind of like it would have been cool to see this person, was a benefit concert about 5 or 6 years ago in Rhode Island. And there was a number of different acts, kind of people that had been with this band or that band, whatever, headliners as well. And we had to leave about 3/4 of the way through the concert. And after I left, who shows up? Because I guess she was dating some Rhode Island politician, but Paul Abdul. And then so what I'm saying, so that's about as in terms of someone that I'm aware of that showed up for the show, but again, right. Good experiences when those things happen.
Yeah, always fun.
Or I'll give you another one, the late Davy Jones, still alive as of this taping, Eric Burden, where members of their band showed up, like a Peter Tork would show up, or a Hilton Valentine would show up and sit in with the band and do House of the Rising Sun. So those kind of things, they're just like icing on the cake, really is.
Yeah.
Now, we talked about smoking versus non-smoking. Outdoor concerts, God knows everything was up for grabs. But back in those days, as I mentioned before, did you find that it interfered with your photography taking with these large plumes of smoke and other assorted things going on? Or that really, it doesn't come out in the photographs?
No, but it was, it's something, it was funny. I was just talking to my wife about this the other day. Sort of related to that, you would get home, coming home, and like particularly the next day, if you like picked up a sweater or a shirt you were wearing and you sniffed it, it was like, oh my God, you could smell all the smoke and stuff, and that era is gone. In terms of photography, there's definitely shows where I think that all the smoke helped enhance the lighting. Some acts, even going back to then, would put out dry ice so that the lights would show up more. You could see the shafts of light, and sometimes I was able to capture that in the photographs. Particularly, there's some pictures of Prince that I don't know if it was so much the smoke in the arena. I'm sure that helped, but it was also the dry ice that they were using that helps you define the lighting. You can see the shafts of light coming down from the light rig above or going across the auditorium.
Julian David Stone joining us for the hour here on Studio 411, author, photographer, also filmmaker, talking about his book, No Cameras Allowed, My Career as an Outlaw Rock and Roll Photographer. For more information, www.juliandavidstone.com. You mentioned earlier the Dead. Talk about your first exposure to Jerry Garcia and how that impacted you. I got the impression you became several younger folks I knew back in the day, you kind of became instant Deadhead to some degree.
Yeah, well, I actually had the weird, because I grew up in the Bay Area, I had the weird sort of occurrence to actually see the Jerry Garcia band and Bobby and the Midnights, which Bob Weir and Jerry Garcia is sort of more or less the two main figures of the Grateful Dead. I saw their solo acts before I saw the Grateful Dead. So when I eventually saw the Grateful Dead, I was pretty far into my rock and roll photography career, and I sort of went to them initially just to photograph them, but then I sort of fell in with a group of other friends who were fans, and then finally about 4 or 5 shows into this experience where I was still primarily going to photograph them, suddenly I was up close and I was taking pictures, and I realized I don't want to take any more pictures. I want to put my camera down and I just want to dance. And so that was kind of the transition from being, okay, I'm a photographer here, to capture the moment, of this famous act, the Grateful Dead, to becoming a deadhead. And I remember that, sort of putting my camera back in my bag and even going to the back farther away from the stage, which is something I never did. You spend the whole show fighting to get closer to take your pictures. And I just wanted to experience the music and dance. And so that was kind of, it also coincided with, for other reasons, which I talk about in the book, where I had now started to go pro with my photography career, and I had to make a choice, which career to follow. So everything kind of came together, and I sort of just fell in love with the Dead, and that sort of became my main musical thing, when I eventually stopped photographing concerts by the end of the 80s.
Now, from the first time that you saw Garcia, with or without the Dead, to his untimely passing in some ways in the mid-90s, how many times do you think you saw the Dead or any incarnation with Jerry? 10, 20 times?
Oh, a lot more than that. I saw the Grateful Dead 110 times, just the Grateful Dead. And then I saw the Jerry Garcia Band probably about 15 times. But the Grateful Dead was a good 110.
Wow.
So I saw them a few times.
In about 10 years. So you really, 10, 11 years, you basically were averaging probably, which I can relate to, about 10 to 15 gigs. And of course, being out where you grew up in California, that made it more conducive because the band was obviously primarily from the San Francisco area in those days.
Right. So you can see them. My biggest year was 1987, and I think I saw them almost 30 times that one year, and I never left the state of California.
Wow.
So that's how often they, that was a big year for them, and they just played the Bay Area a lot, and they played Southern California. So you can see a lot of them without having to travel too far.
Amazing. Now, by doing this book, again, just an observation, see what you think. Not only have you become, besides a photographer, a filmmaker, an author, but to me, because of the book, because of the tremendous history with these photos, I think you've kind of become a historian, because it's not just the experience of you taking them, but you also have these tremendous stories. And I'm sure as you have gotten older, you've then even gone back and found maybe a little bit more a history of some of these individuals besides the Dead. I mean, would you agree with that? That you've really, in our old age, become really more multifaceted than maybe you even give yourself credit for?
Oh, no question. When I sort of wrapped all this up in the late 80s, and for the last 30 years, I've been just carrying this archive of negatives, because again, this is not digital, this is actual physical negatives. And one, it's kind of a miracle any of them survived, all the different dorm room moves, and after college, all the different places I lived. And two, because like you said, so much time has passed, it's like a historical archive now. And it's been really interesting once the pictures have been out there in the world, first through the Kickstarter and now through the promotion of the book and people reading the book. Different people have reached out to me with moments of sort of rock and roll history that I didn't realize that, I had caught, because I was just photographing like just a random weird thing that happened. I have pictures of David Gilmour of Pink Floyd. He's the lead guitarist of Pink Floyd in the book. Well, apparently the pictures that I have are of him playing a guitar that he only played for a few shows. So I got all kinds of fans of Pink Floyd reaching out to me going, oh my God, these pictures are so rare. And people who are fans of rare guitars. I guess it's an unusual Fender guitar that he didn't play for very long. So that's kind of the type of thing like you're talking about, where these are now a historical record. And there's been other incidences like that I have discovered once the book has been out and the pictures have been on the internet.
And too, with the passing of time, and I saw an image of, like many of us that had either slides or negatives, whatever, they're always in these little, like, kind of narrow boxes, that they used to provide you or whatever, besides a photo album if you develop them. But the point is, you wind up packing them away, hopefully in a well-lit, or not well-lit, but air-conditioned, cool area. And then all of a sudden you go back, and then sometimes you're like, well, I forgot I even shot that, I mean, so it must have been a rush of memories putting this project together.
Oh, no question. I mean, to a large degree, I was seeing these pictures for the first time, because back then, and I think you sort of alluded to it, I in the book, I also have pictures of the lists I used to keep back in the 80s of all my concerts. So, I was shooting 5 shows a week. So sometimes I'd come back from a show, I'd develop a bunch of rolls of black and white, I'd make contact sheets, which anybody from back in the day might remember are little, you would just lay the negatives on a piece of photo paper and expose them, so you had little, like, 1-inch images of your photos, and you would look at them with a magnifier, and maybe I would print a couple of them out, and otherwise the other 200 would just be put away and never really looked at. So when I did this, suddenly there were all these pictures that I was really seeing for the first time, and some great photos, a ton of which ended up in the book that I had really never seen before. So yeah, it brought back so many memories, and it's just been really, really fun to put together. And the response from people has been the best part, because it's elicited memories from other people, from people who went to these shows and saw these artists back in the 80s.
We've got a shot of U2 with Bono, one of several concerts you attended over the years. This is back in the early days. I mean, Bono was, who I believe is getting close to 60 at this point. So we're talking at this point, he's like a youngster of 23, 24, 25 years old. Tell me quickly there, your first encounter with U2 at a concert. I believe you did a little traveling that time.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you first a couple of funny stories with Bono that you mentioned. These pictures are so old of him. This is the early 80s, and we'll get to some of the uniqueness of it in a minute, but he's not wearing glasses. So people don't recognize him. And my wife is a few years younger than me, and I was showing her these pictures. She didn't know it was Bono, because she'd never seen a picture of him without, his very distinctive glasses on. So these pictures that I have in the book, the first batch are in 1983, when I was an old man of basically 18, 19, still a teenager. I went to Europe on my own, and I shot some concerts there. And one of them I was fortunate enough to shoot was was U2 in Ireland in 1983, and this was again one of the ones that I found out later was kind of a historical event, because it was kind of their homecoming. This was right around the time the War album had come out, and they had gone from being, starting to get to be well known to becoming huge stars, and they hadn't played back in their hometown of Dublin in over a year. They'd been out supporting the album, so it was a very emotional show. They brought a cake out on stage. So that's how much of a hometown feel it had. And I really like these pictures I have of them in Ireland. They played on this amazing bill at an outdoor racetrack, and it was just a fantastic show.
We've got, obviously, the copy of the book that's here in front of me. We've also got a shot that if we can go to that, we'll give you a little quiz, and everybody remind me to give the answer before we leave you today. We've got Bono, U2. Again, you can see the still that we have on the screen. Then we have Prince, and then we have a young lady here that, again, who is this young lady here? I'll give you a hint. It's not Cyndi Lauper. But at first I thought, geez, is it Cyndi? Because I saw kind of that grimace that she, where she kind of squints her eyes. So remind me to tell you who that is. But those are just some of the shots that Julian David Stone, our guest today, has taken.
I'll throw out a clue. I won't give it away, but I'll throw out a clue to your audience, or 2 little ones. One, she's still very much playing today, and 2, she just recently got inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
That's right. So, and I'll throw in another one, which won't help you unless you were with me at the concert. But it leads me to my next question. What was the best double bill you ever saw? And I will just say that the mystery guest here, the mystery performer, opened for The Who. And this was some 3 or 4 years ago at a concert I attended. But again, I'm not going to tell you who that is until later. So twofold for you. What's the best double bill? I know one in the book that I'm going to throw out after, that you photographed, and a double bill that you witnessed without going there to photograph.
Sure. Well, I can tell you one that I did take some pictures of, but none of them are in the book because I basically was not really there to photograph, and I think I was on a date, so I wasn't really, and it was at a stadium. I saw the Clash open for The Who, That was pretty amazing. But I was like, was at the LA Coliseum, and I think we were literally in the back row. So we were just there to enjoy it. So I think I took a couple of snaps, but those are definitely not in the book. But that was an amazing show. And then there were some great festival lineups with Huey Lewis and the Cars. Oh my God! I just saw some amazing lineups. I'm trying to think of who else. Well, what was the one you were going to throw out?
Well, I was going to say that one, and I'll throw out the one I mentioned earlier when we were talking about the price of tickets. Again, it was kind of like the guy wasn't famous yet, but think about it. In retrospect, 1977, I think it was February of that year, I see Jimmy Buffett open for the Eagles on their Hotel California tour. So, that was, that was pretty amazing. But in retrospect, because the person was not really that well known, I think he was on his first or second album, tour, et cetera, et cetera. But, you knew there was something there because, I remembered some of the stuff the guy did, and that kind of is not the case usually with bands when you see them,
Right.
Then you were talking about like festival lineups. I was talking to a drummer, acquaintance of mine, a guy named Donnie Baldwin, who again was with Elvin Bishop and now is the drummer with Jefferson Starship. And he was talking, he and I were talking about concerts in the 70s and 80s. And he was saying, yeah, wasn't that weird when they used to have these like trifectas? They used to have like 3 bands and God knows what they were getting paid. Probably not as much as today for sure. But it was interesting. I saw one time, and he remembered this lineup. It was Elvin Bishop, a band named Rough Diamond, who featured the former lead singer of Uriah Heep, and then into Peter Frampton. And this was during the Frampton, or no, it was during the IMU tour. So it was after Frampton Comes Alive. But of course, it was like God was descending onto the New Haven Coliseum. So amazing shows. But that was kind of again like a festival / multiple lineup. Duos. The one I'm referring to now in the book that I thought was interesting, a little strange, but still must have been entertaining, was, and we have shots of both, was David Bowie, and then I guess opening for them was the Go-Go's, Belinda Carlisle and company.
Yeah, no, that was actually I'm glad you brought that one up because Madness was also on the lineup. So it was quite a show. I have pictures of Madness in my book, the English band, but it was from a different gig. The pictures of the Go-Go's opening for Bowie this was Bowie when he had this huge success in the early 80s with, I think the song was Let's Dance. And the tour was called the Serious Moonlight Tour. That was what he called his tour. So the Go-Go's were opening for him for about 5 shows on this tour. They were doing a bunch of California dates with him, so they called it their Serious Barbecue Tour. And I always thought that was pretty funny.
Your best friend was in the crowd with you one time when the crowds were so large that the security people couldn't handle everything, including watching people with cameras. Did you find that the bigger the crowds, like for instance when you were at Shea Stadium in the 80s to see the Police, you came to New York, did you find that worked better for you? Or you talk in the book that a lot of times you didn't really go with anybody because you didn't want to kind of put them in a bad situation unless they were a photographer, and in some cases they wound up getting their stuff confiscated and you didn't.
Right. Every situation was different, and I talk about the show at at Shea Stadium with the Police. The stadiums were a plus minus. The plus was because there were so many people there, security just generally couldn't handle it, and they would pat you down, but it wasn't as aggressive a search as you would get sometimes going into a club because they had to process so many people. The minus was once you got in, you had to really fight to get close enough to photograph because, like particularly with the Police at Shea Stadium, some of these people had been in line for days waiting for this show because this was the Police in 1983. They're at the top of the world. They have the #1 album. I mean, it was just impossible. It was packed, and people had fought hard for their spot, on the floor, and I just had to fight my way forward. And in the story that I tell there, in this case, I got a big assist from Mother Nature because right as I was fighting my way forward and it was getting harder and harder, one of those great New York out of the blue summer downpours hits the crowd, everybody scatters, and by this point, I had a rain poncho was part of my standard gear. I threw it on, went right to the front, and I spent the whole show in the front row. So in that case, the crowd, or I was helped by Mother Nature to deal with the crowd.
Exactly. One of several shots, we've got a shot there of Sting, a shirt off again at the apex of probably even his career. I mean, not to diminish what he did as a solo artist, but that's how big, as I would concur with Julian, the Police were huge. Now, I have to ask, did you feel the ghosts of the Beatles there at Shea? Because that was some 18 years apart. Did you kind of feel a vibe when you were there, or did you have no idea that the Beatles had played there in 1965?
Oh, no, I had, because I was, again, as I told you, I got a French horn. I wanted to play the French horn because John Lennon held one on the cover of Sgt. Pepper. So I was a Beatles fanatic. So I was very aware of it. Nobody plays Shea Stadium without that. I mean, it is part of all the lore of any performance at Shea Stadium. I swear it gets, understandably compared to when the Beatles played there, because they were really the first to sell out a stadium. So, oh no, it was definitely, a part of it. And in fact, again, another discovery when these pictures went out into the world, and I got inundated from Police fans, because this gig in the history of the Police apparently was the moment when they decided to break up, partly, like you said, because they had just sold out Shea Stadium. Where do you go from there? And that was really what they realized. They did still make a little bit more music after that, but really that was where they first made the decision, as I discovered from all these Police fans, to break up, and largely because of what you said. It's such a mecca of rock and roll, and once you've done it, you've done what the Beatles did and sold out Shea Stadium. Where do you go from there? And that's kind of what they realized.
I'm trying to remember, not that you were necessarily there, but when 2 years later in '85 that they had Live Aid, the Police by then, I believe, had broken up. Do you recall, did they make an appearance at Live Aid, or did Sting? I don't think so.
I don't remember, but I can tell you kind of a funny story related to Live Aid and the Grateful Dead. Just quickly, I was at a Grateful Dead concert that same weekend. It would just happen to be, it was like July 13th and 14th, I think, of '85. And obviously, I was on the other side of the country in California seeing the Dead. In fact, I think some of the pictures in the book are from the Grateful Dead in Ventura, California. Well, everybody knew Live Aid was going on at the same time, and it was a big deal. Well, at intermission of the Grateful Dead show, they cut live in between the sets to the feed coming out of New York. So you can imagine what it was like to be with a Grateful Dead crowd listening to Madonna. It was very interesting.
And of course, I just saw it recently because of the major success in the last couple of years of the film Bohemian Rhapsody. Went and kind of did some research and came across the famous almost 30-minute performance of Freddie Mercury in Queen. So there was another one where, if someone hadn't seen it, my God, I mean, that's some performance, and that was with the original band. I mean, they recreated it beautifully in the film, but I mean, just there's another one. You talk in the book, too, that you felt that you photographed a lot of the acts that really made their mark in the 80s. In other words, like bands like the one I mentioned earlier, Eagles and Van Halen and others. They started in the 70s, but you really, captured a lot of folks that, really hit the mark in the 80s and just exploded. Like one guy, for instance, or one band, Huey Lewis and the News. We've got a shot that you took of Huey. I mean, it's hard to explain. I mean, he's kind of like a quirky, good-looking guy. The music's got catchy hooks. It didn't hurt, rather, that they were in some movies like Back to the Future. But what was it about Huey, as you were photographing him, that you thought, wow, this band is really going to explode here?
Well, it's interesting. It was the Sports album. That's what the name of the album was, that exploded, that really, took them over the top. I think it had 3 or 4 #1 singles. And when I photographed him, I saw him in 1983, the night before New Year's Eve, and he was playing in a small club, but they'd already had several #1 hits, because clearly they had booked this gig 6 or 8 months in advance. And by now they could have been playing much bigger venues, but they still fulfilled this commitment. So you could just tell there was an energy on them, that they knew that they were, that this was their moment, and they were, as I describe it, like an express train to fame, because they were just on their way up. And sure enough, a year later to the day, they were, this was a small club. They played across the bay and sold out a 24,000 seat auditorium on the same exact date a year later. So they went from playing in front of about 400 to 24,000 in 1 year, and that was the moment I caught when they were on that express train to fame with that huge album and all those hits coming out.
Julian David Stone, photographer, filmmaker, now historian. You can say that I coined that, but no cameras allowed. My career as an outlaw rock and roll photographer, published by For the Duration Press. Julian joining us here in the remaining moments on Studio 411. Tell me about Billy Joel. We've got a shot of Billy, I believe, and the famous peacoat story. The only time I'd heard about the peacoat was years ago, David Crosby telling a story how he got hassled on an Ed Sullivan taping because the guy didn't like the peacoat he was wearing. So that's the only kind of recollection I have of a peacoat. Tell me, or tell the audience, why the peacoat was so advantageous for what you were doing.
Well, as as the stories are all in the book of all the adventures I had with roadies and security, because I was smuggling my equipment in. I decided I got an Old Navy peacoat and I modified it because it hung down almost to my ankles. And I modified it so that I could hide the equipment down. I could slip it inside the lining below the pockets, and I could hide all my equipment down there and use it to get through security, because they pat you down on your chest and maybe they'd go down to your waist, but they weren't going to go all the way down to the hem, because now I was using this modified coat. Well, when I went to see Billy Joel, that was the first time that I used it. And it was one of the few times that I had gone with somebody else to the show. In fact, it was a friend whose father who worked at a film studio and had gotten us really good tickets to the show. So I was a little nervous because it was the first time I was using this coat. Fortunately, I didn't get caught. It worked just as I hoped it would, and I got great pictures of Billy Joel, and I used the coat quite a bit after that.
Tell me about now, we talked a little bit about Bowie, of course, his passing in 2016. Tell me a little bit about Prince. Obviously, as we talked about, one of the main players in the cover of your book. Tell me about, again, what an impression this tremendous talent made on you.
Sure. Well, again, this was Prince in 1985 in the Purple Rain era, and this was the closest to Beatlemania that I had personally experienced, because he was everywhere with the #1 movie, the #1 album, and I had just started college at this point, and I remember walking through the dorm of the school, and you could hear that album coming out of every room. Everybody was playing it, and you'd hear it at different places on the album. So when he came to town, I was absolutely sure I was going to be there to photograph him. In fact, I went out and I bought a special brand new lens, and it only came the night before the concert. So when we got to the show, I was in the parking lot. I was also going to this one with some friends. I started to get ready to go in and started to hide the stuff on my body. Well, lo and behold, the lens was too big. It wouldn't work anywhere. And I desperately wanted to get it in. Well, fortunately, this was the 1980s, and women's hair was really, really big. And this female friend of mine at the show always carried with her a huge can of Aquanet. So I got the brilliant idea of, let's hide the lens in your purse under the can of Aquanet. So we go up to see the security guard. I can see him, I remember him eyeing her purse going, what's that cylindrical object in there? Thinking he's caught us. He opens the purse, he looks and he sees the can of Aquanet, looks at her hair and goes, oh, okay, and lets us on in, not looking underneath to see the huge lens. So that's how I was able to get this lens in. And of any show I ever saw, it's the highest percentage of photos that I'm happy with. It's my favorite photo ever is a photo of Prince that I took at that show, and I have so many great pictures of Prince at the show. And the show was one for the ages. Like, he just did everything. He danced, he sings, he played guitar, he sermonized, and all of it in high heels. So that was Prince. He was just incredible and at his absolute prime.
Hey, that was a twin pack of Aquanet, is what I would have told the guy. You know what I'm saying? It's a lot of hairspray in those days. Circa 1985, you get approached by 2 magazine outfits based on your portfolio of work, which started to get notoriety. And also then later on, not too far after that, you also were contacted by Rolling Stone magazine. So obviously a lot of things are happening for you, you know, and just I think at that point, obviously, you knew that you were onto something, even though it took a heck of a lot of work to get it done.
Yeah, absolutely. It was so fun, and I was so young and just, you know, I was just loving it. I had no idea that sort of it was kind of unusual that, you know, I was working professionally as a rock and roll photographer, and I wasn't even 21 yet. So it was so much fun and such a great time to have been doing it. Such a great era.
What bands or performers do you wish that you had had the opportunity to photograph who were still active in the 80s? That you didn't during those years and perhaps never got a chance? Anyone like a Michael Jackson or a band, perhaps, you know, Van Halen, somebody that, in other words, you never had the opportunity, the Stones, that just, it didn't work out with your schedule?
Yeah, God, so many of them. I mean, if you want only bands that were around then still playing, I would have loved to have shot Queen. I you know, with all the popularity now, not just that, that's a band I wish I had seen. So many of them, all the ones you mentioned, I would have, you know, even though he was sadly gone by then, would have loved to have shot Elvis. I mean, that would have been a dream come true. I would have loved to have shot Elvis in like 54 or 55, you know, at a county fair when he's still, you know, when he's first starting out. I have pictures of Chuck Berry in my book, and they're some of my favorites because I shot him at a county fair, you know, and it was a stage that I swear didn't even have a back on it. And that was just the most perfect, you know, that was the beginning of rock and roll. It was, you know, he showed up and played with a band that he picked up there, and he was just tremendous. And so I would have loved to have had that same sort of experience photographing Elvis back in the 50s when he was still, you know, at that level. That would have been a dream.
I had a guest on a couple of years ago who was a longtime promoter, still active, Carl LeBate, up in the New York State area. He tells a great story. We have an image of Chuck Berry, by the way, of Chuck, that he was booked for 2 shows. And Chuck, you know, you basically had to pay him or he didn't go on stage because, you know, it had to be cash or whatever due to a lot of issues. But it was the funny thing. He did the first show, tremendous response. Then Carl looks around like, where's Chuck? Well, thank goodness he practically had to almost jump on the bumper because Chuck was getting in his car and was leaving, and must not have realized, or maybe didn't want to realize, that the second show hadn't yet taken place. Julian David Stone, in our remaining moments here, tell me real quick, October of '85, while you did film a few things after that, very quickly, Springsteen, you had a tremendous meltdown of sorts where your camera totally collapsed on you, and that really kind of traumatized you or made you think, you know, maybe this isn't the way I should go, and ultimately you did turn to filmmaking.
Yeah, I was through this all, even though this rock and roll career was completely exploding, I was studying film. It was like, well, this rock and roll thing is just for fun. I'm going to be a filmmaker. That's really what I'm going to do. So I was in film school as this was all taking off, and I was having trouble sustaining both because I needed to be going to class and making films and studying film. Meanwhile, I was getting calls all the time to shoot shows. I was down in Los Angeles by now to go into town and shoot shows, and I was really struggling with it. Well, Springsteen came to town, and I didn't have passes for the show, so I thought, oh, I'll smuggle my equipment in for old time's sake. Smuggled my equipment in. Long story short, I shot 20 rolls of film, and 18 of them were blank. My camera had malfunctioned at the very beginning of the show, and I was just devastated. And I went, you know what? That's it. That's the sign I've been looking for. I can't sustain the duality of this career anymore. And I hung up the rock and roll photography. You know, a decision to this day, I'm not sure if I did the right thing, but nonetheless, that's what I did. I still had a few more assignments that I'd already committed to shoot, and I finished those up, and then that was the end of the career. I still, you know, over the years dabbled here and there, and especially now digitally, I'll bring a camera on for fun. But in terms of the body of work that really makes up my archive in the book, and that was pretty much where it ended, you know, around 86, 87.
Julian David Stone, our guest today on Studio 411. The book, No Cameras Allowed, My Career as an Outlaw Rock and Roll Photographer, 1981 to 1987. By the way, the image, that's Joan Jett, not Cyndi Lauper. So for those of you who didn't know who it is, Joan Jett, who, of course, you saw, I saw open for The Who a few years ago, Rock and Roll Hall of Famer in her own right, tremendous, tremendous artist as well. Julian, you are a tremendous historian, author, filmmaker. We look forward to having you back on. For more information, juliandavidstone.com. You can also, for more information, find Julian Twitter at Julian D. Stone and Instagram at Julian David Stone. We thank you for taking a few minutes to come join us, and we look forward to more from you, and we hope to have you back on again.
Oh, I'd love to do it again. Thank you. It's been really fun.
Hang in there for a second. We thank you for joining us here on this episode of Studio 411. Larry DeSilva is my name, and we look forward to seeing you again. Take care.